You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining The American Revolution. This week, episode 331, Washington Goes Home. Last week, we covered the British evacuation of New York. At the same time that the British were leaving, the Continental Army was continuing its process of disbanding. As we discussed back in episode 327, the Continental Congress furloughed most of the army in June of 1783. The furloughs allowed the soldiers to return home, but avoided the issue of settling their back pay and other benefits that were owed to them, and it also permitted the Congress to recall the Army if some unforeseen events happened and the Army had to react. By October, Congress made that furlough permanent and discharged everyone that was already on furlough. It also discharged all the Continental soldiers except for a small contingent at Fort Pitt and a few hundred officers and men who were still in New York. Washington, who was in Princeton with Congress at the time, had been lobbying for a standing army to remain during the peace. Part of Washington's concerns were over the western forts, such as Detroit, which were supposed to be turned over to the Americans, but were still being held by the British. Washington had sent an officer to discuss the turnover pursuant to the terms of the peace treaty. The commander there, in Canada, Friedrich Haldimand, refused to discuss any turnover until he'd received direct orders from London, which he had not. Without an army to force the issue, the British garrisons remained on U.S. territory. Despite such matters, the cost of such an army, combined with the general notion that standing armies in peacetime were not necessary, prevented Congress from accepting Washington's arguments. Congress ordered the final discharge of the Army. It also accepted the resignation of Secretary of War Benjamin Lincoln, who wished to return to his home in Massachusetts. Washington himself was also eager to get home. Around this time, he wrote a former officer in France, quote, "I, who am only waiting for the ceremonials or till the British forces shall have taken leave of New York, am placed in an awkward and disagreeable situation, it being my anxious desire to quit the walks of public life, and under the shadow of my own vine and my own fig tree, to seek those enjoyments and that relaxation which a mind that has been constantly upon the stretch for more than 8 years stands so much in need of. I have fixed this epoch to the arrival of the definitive treaty or the evacuation of my country by our newly acquired friends." On November 2nd, Washington issued his farewell orders to the Army. He announced Congress's decision to discharge virtually all of the Army, and he took a moment to reflect on the amazing accomplishment of defeating the British Army. He called it, quote, "little short of a standing miracle." He admitted that he could not begin to describe in his address all of the hardships that they had faced over the course of the war. He hoped they all would acknowledge the, quote, "prospect of happiness opened by the confirmation of our independence and sovereignty." He called on the officers and men to be as virtuous and useful as citizens as they had been persevering and victorious as soldiers. The general acknowledged the frustrations over the debts to them, but called on them to remain honorably supportive of the government, and even called on them to support a stronger federal government that would be capable of paying off all the war debts. Washington concluded by offering his thanks to all, professing his attachment and friendship, and called on heaven's blessings as he concluded his own military service. During the same time, an embarrassing diplomatic incident also occurred. In October, the new Dutch ambassador to the U.S. arrived in Philadelphia. Peter Jan van Berkel had been the mayor of Rotterdam. His brother had played a role in the draft treaty that caused Britain to go to war with the Netherlands. The ambassador arrived not only to establish formal diplomatic relations, but also with some much-needed cash from a loan that had been arranged in Europe. Ambassador Van Berkel was shocked to find that there was no official in Philadelphia to greet him. Congress, of course, had left for Princeton much earlier, an event about which he was unaware. The Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Robert Livingston, had resigned and gone home to New York by this time. The ambassador managed to rent a room at City Tavern, and figured out that Congress had moved to Princeton, he sent a letter announcing his arrival. It took several days for Congress to receive the letter. President Elias Boudinot immediately dispatched his secretary to Philadelphia with apologies. When Van Berkel made his way to Princeton, a cavalry escort and various officials finally turned out to greet him. It was an inauspicious beginning to diplomatic relations and a sign that Congress still had a long way to go in establishing a functioning government. As I discussed last week, Washington traveled from Princeton to West Point in mid-November to await the final British evacuation. When he left Princeton, he forwarded the bulk of his baggage to Virginia, anticipating that he would be on his way home after his ceremonial entry into New York. When the British Army finally pulled away on November 25th, Washington and the Continentals rode into town that same day. New York City itself was a wreck. It had suffered 2 major fires during the British occupation, and no one bothered to rebuild anything. The British simply used burned-out lots as areas for camping. The occupying army had also burned most of the fences and other combustible materials, particularly in their final months of occupation. Many of the civilians, both those who had remained and those who were returning, appeared emaciated and with frayed clothing, owing to years of deprivation and hard living. Many witnesses contrasted the neat polished uniforms of the departing British with the bedraggled look of the Continentals and militia who took back the city. Now, despite the appearances of the town or the people, the event was a joyful one. Washington had been focused on retaking New York for most of the war and was pleased that the matter was finally complete. That evening, Governor Clinton hosted a party at Fraunces Tavern, which Washington and his officers attended. The guests drank 13 toasts, the first being to the United States of America. Bonfires and fireworks continued celebrations into the night. Washington made his quarters in the house across the street from the tavern. For the next few days, he received visitors there, many of whom were returning New York patriots who had fled the city years earlier. Washington also gave several public addresses and attended various banquets and parties in the evenings. On his second day in the city, Washington and Alexander Hamilton paid a morning visit to Hercules Mulligan, an Irish tailor. They shared a breakfast with the local. Mulligan and Hamilton had actually been college roommates before the war. Mulligan, who was a few years older, had been involved in some of the early activities by the Sons of Liberty before the war. But when the British captured the town, Mulligan remained a civilian in the city under British rule. Now, the reason Washington visited him was to thank him publicly for his services during the war. Unbeknownst to almost anyone, Mulligan had been a member of the Culper spy ring and had provided invaluable intelligence to Washington during the war. The commander-in-chief wanted to make a public call to make sure everyone knew that Mulligan was not a British collaborator as he had appeared during the occupation. After a week and a half in the city, on December 4th, the British fleet finally sailed out into open sea. Washington held a final party for his officers at Fraunces Tavern that began at noon that day. The only account of the event comes from Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, who wrote about it in his memoirs decades later. Quote, "We had been assembled but a few moments when His Excellency entered the room. After partaking of a slight refreshment in an almost breathless silence, the general filled his glass with wine and turning to his officers said, 'With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable.'" After the officers had taken a glass of wine, Washington said, quote, "I cannot come to each of you, but shall feel obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand." General Knox, the closest officer to Washington, walked up to the general, and the two hugged and kissed, with tears running down their faces. In the same affectionate manner, every officer in the room marched up and parted with the general-in-chief. Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I have never before witnessed, and finally hope I may never be called to witness again. The lunch ended, and the officers escorted their commander to the wharf, where a ferry carried him to New Jersey. The officers then took leave of each other, and return home to their new lives as civilians. Now, before he could return home, Washington would have to submit his formal resignation to Congress. He could no longer go to Princeton to do that because, Congress was gone. We discussed several weeks ago how Congress had to flee from Philadelphia after the city failed to protect Congress from mutinous Continental soldiers. Congress had remained in Princeton for months, but the delegates found it unsuited to their needs. The small college town had few taverns and no real social life. Living quarters were also rather cramped. During most of the time Congress was there, it only had delegations from 6 states, meaning it didn't even have a quorum to conduct any business. In October, after finally getting enough delegates for a quorum, Congress decided that it was going to need its own capital. It resolved to build a federal town somewhere on the banks of the Delaware River where buildings suitable for Congress could be built. The southern states felt neglected by this resolution. So a few days later, Congress passed another resolution calling for an alternate federal town also to be established on the banks of the Potomac River. At the time, Congress anticipated the idea of moving back and forth between these two capitals. As it would take several years to build the new capitals, Congress resolved to meet in Annapolis, Maryland, and Trenton, New Jersey in alternating years. Congress then adjourned on November 12th, agreeing to meet again in Annapolis a couple of weeks later. Now, the move to Annapolis didn't do much for attendance. It took several weeks for the delegates from at least 7 states to show up, giving Congress a quorum. Now, this was a concern, especially because there was one issue where the clock was really ticking. Just before Congress departed Princeton at the end of November, it received the final peace treaty from Paris. The final article of the treaty required both countries to ratify and exchange copies of the treaty within 6 months of the initial signing in early September. Nearly 3 months had passed until the treaty arrived before Congress. It could take another 3 months for a return voyage to complete that exchange. So it was critical that the treaty be ratified as soon as possible. If not, the British could reopen negotiations. With France and Spain now having agreed to peace, and since Britain had given the Americans so many concessions solely so that the war with France and Spain would end, Britain really could have the option to take back many of the provisions and demand more concessions from the United States before it agreed to a new treaty. Congress thought that it should avoid that possibility, even if it was a remote one, by complying with the terms of the 6-month deadline. Unfortunately, when they received the treaty, there were only 6 state delegations in attendance, meaning Congress could do nothing. When Congress reconvened in Maryland in mid-December, there were 7 state delegations present. Now, that was enough for a quorum, but the Articles of Confederation required that 9 states approve all important matters, and a treaty ending the war was an important matter. Congress anxiously awaited the arrival of 2 more state delegations. It took about a month before delegates from Connecticut arrived. A few days later, Richard Beresford of South Carolina arrived, allowing the South Carolina delegation to vote and giving Congress 9 votes to ratify the treaty on January 17, 1784. It was unclear if the ship could get to London by the March 3rd deadline. Congress sent 3 copies on different ships, hoping that one of them would arrive in time. One copy went to New York, where a French packet ship was about to leave. The ship left with the treaty a few days later, but ran aground and had to return to the harbor. The other 2 copies could not find a ship headed for Europe for more than a month, so Congress missed its deadline. Fortunately, Britain was in no mood to reopen negotiations. When the treaty arrived in London, 2 months past the deadline, the diplomats exchanged ratifications, thus formally ending the war with some finality on May 12, 1784. Washington was going to have to go to Annapolis to complete his military service. After leaving New York City, he stopped in Trenton, where he met with the governor and other state officials, spending 2 days there. He then traveled to Philadelphia, where he met with State President John Dickinson, Robert Morris, 2 of his old generals, Arthur Sinclair and Edward Hand. Once again, he was celebrated with parties and public celebrations. He also addressed the State Assembly, groups of merchants, and the public. He attended a ball at City Tavern. When he left Philadelphia more than a week later, French Ambassador Luzerne, President John Dickinson, and Robert Morris all escorted him out of the city. The following day, he paused in Wilmington, Delaware, to accept the honors of officials there. 2 days later, he was sitting at a public dinner in Baltimore. Everybody wanted a moment with the conquering hero, spending time to appreciate what he had done and bask in the glory of this victory. Finally, on Friday the 19th, Washington rode into Annapolis. As he had come to expect, he was met with an honor guard several miles before he entered the city. Among the men greeting him were Generals Horatio Gates and William Smallwood. The following day, Washington sent a letter to Congress announcing his intention to resign and asked whether Congress would prefer it in writing or in person. Congress resolved to see him, but only 3 days later, on Tuesday, December 23rd. So Washington had to spend the weekend and Monday visiting with others in Annapolis. On Monday night, Congress also gave him a public dinner with about 200 people in attendance. Finally, on Tuesday, Washington was admitted to Congress, which met in the Senate chamber in the Maryland State House. The new president of Congress, Thomas Mifflin, received him along with the delegations of the 7 states who were in attendance. Mifflin was the only delegate present who was in Congress when they first granted Washington his commission in 1775. If Washington still held a grudge against Mifflin over the Conway Cabal, he did not give any indication of it at this time. Washington had the Congressional Secretary, Charles Thompson, read his farewell address to the members seated. Like most of Washington's speeches, it was a short one, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes long. He formally resigned his commission. Interestingly, he referred to the United States in the singular form, quote, "happy in the confirmation of our independence and sovereignty, and pleased with the opportunity afforded the United States of becoming a respectable nation. I resign with satisfaction the appointment I accepted with diffidence." He included a brief plea that Congress make good on the promises of pay and pensions to the Army. It's also interesting, if you look at his written notes from which he made the speech, he made a few last changes to his address. He changed, quote, "a final farewell" to "an affectionate farewell." And he changed "take my ultimate leave of all employments of public life" by removing the word ultimate. Perhaps he was thinking already that this might not be his final act in public life. When the speech concluded, Washington bowed and left the room for his formal exit. He then came back in and chatted with some of the delegates and with other prominent members of Maryland society who were present. One witness reported, quote, "the general seemed so much affected himself that everybody felt for him. He addressed Congress in a short speech, but very affecting. Many tears were shed. I think the world never produced a greater man, and very few so good." That evening, Congress hosted one more dinner for Washington's honor with 13 toasts and 13 cannons. After that, Maryland Governor William Paca hosted a grand ball at the State House. Months later, when the tavern keeper who hosted the dinner submitted a rather large bill, noting, quote, "the entertainment was given to a numerous assemblage of guests and was exceedingly plentiful, and the provisions and liquors good in their kind," Congress ended up striking out the explanation for the bill, not wanting their constituents to read in the public record the extravagant costs of food and liquor at the party. With his service and social obligations complete, Washington, still with a retinue in tow, rode for Mount Vernon. They arrived on Christmas Eve. 2 of their grandchildren, Nellie and Wash, were there to greet them, as were the staff and a host of other visitors and well-wishers. A young girl who was present wrote, quote, "the general and madame came home on Christmas Eve, and such a racket the servants made, for they were glad of their coming. 3 handsome young officers came in with them. All Christmas afternoon people came to pay their respects and duty. The general seemed very happy." The general was in fact home and ready to enjoy the peaceful comforts of domestic life for the first time in nearly 9 years. George Washington was content to be home with a job well done. While the war had come to an end, though, internal conflicts about how the new country would grow continued, And next week we'll get to that as we look at the controversy over the Society of the Cincinnati. Hi, thanks for joining the American Revolution podcast after show on the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Salentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Chasen Harrison, and Anthony McGinnis, and Patrick LeBeau. I really do appreciate everyone who can help support this podcast, either through a subscription on Patreon or a one-time gift via PayPal or Venmo. This really means a lot to me. One other quick reminder as we get closer to Christmas shopping, you can do me a big favor by using one of my book links to start any shopping that you do on Amazon. If you start with my link, I get a small commission on any purchase you make during that session, even if you don't buy the linked item that sent you to Amazon in the first place. This is a great way to support the podcast without spending any money that you weren't going to spend anyway. I also want to mention that I've designed a number of Revolution t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, and other things that are available for sale on tpublic.com. Some have the podcast logo, some are just Revolution-themed design. So if you have friends or family who are interested, these can make great holiday presents. And if there is a design you want and don't see there, ask me about it. I can probably make something that you would like. There are the book links and the t-shirt links at the bottom of each blog episode and also on my website. Also, a quick programming note. I'm going to be out of the country for most of November. I'm trying to pre-record some episodes now, but I'm likely going to miss a week or two of regular episodes. If I do, don't worry. The podcast isn't coming to an end. I will return to my regular schedule when I get home again near the end of the month. Now, this week, Washington finally retook New York City following the evacuation of the British Army, and then he took a victory lap down the East Coast where he was celebrated by all. He was able to resign in Congress in Annapolis and finally made it home for Christmas. Now, there's a famous story told by Benjamin West, an artist who lived in London during the war. West was originally from Pennsylvania. He traveled to Europe many years before the war began to study art, and he settled in England. When the war began, he remained in England, but was strongly in support of the Patriot cause. As a great portrait artist, West had the opportunity to paint King George III on several occasions. When the king sat for a portrait, he would often chat with the artist, and he enjoyed chatting with West about America since he knew West was from the colonies. In the summer of 1782, West was painting a portrait for the king. George asked him what he thought Washington would do if America received independence. West replied that he expected Washington would go home and return to private life. The king responded, if he did, he would be the greatest man in the world. Now, in saying that, the king was expressing skepticism that Washington would in fact relinquish power. The king believed that human nature was to seize power when it was available. He'd seen it through history in attempts to seize the crown, and probably saw it on a smaller scale every day as many important men continually fought for greater importance and power within the British government. Consistent with this human nature, the king assumed Washington would make himself a leader of this new independent nation. The idea of a man simply walking away from power was inconceivable. The king wasn't alone in this thinking. Probably most men on both sides of the Atlantic expected, or at least feared, that a military commander would seize an opportunity for power. One reason Congress gave Washington the command of the Continental Army years before was that they at least hoped that he would not use the army in such a way, but there was always a concern that it could happen. In fact, next week when we discuss the establishment of the Society of Cincinnati, we'll see just how much the fear remained that military officers might remain a threat to an elected civilian government and the principles of equality under the law. This moment in Washington's life, when he walked away from power, may have been his greatest. Not only did he manage to win the war against Britain, something probably most people, including himself, thought was impossible at the outset, but he walked away from power and simply went home in the moment of his greatest victory. This simple act of not trying to seize power made Washington a hero in the eyes of Americans and a source of admiration in much of the rest of the world. Washington's journey home in December 1783 was not just celebrated for his victory over Britain, he was also being celebrated for the simple fact of going home. My book recommendation this week is General Washington's Christmas Farewell, A Mount Vernon Homecoming, 1783, by Stanley Weintraub. This is a pretty short book, less than 200 pages, but it focuses almost entirely on the issues covered this week. It starts with Washington moving into evacuated New York and follows him to his return to Mount Vernon about a month later. The book was first published in 2003. So if you want to get a book that really focuses on just the events of this final month of Washington's service, get General Washington's Christmas Farewell. My online recommendation is the text of Washington's speech when he resigned his commission at Annapolis. It's extremely short, but I think worth reading. The copy of the speech that I've posted is on the Maryland government's website. As always, I've included direct links on my blog and website. My question this week comes from Steve Kochersberger, who asks, there are several contemporary groups who claim that the American Revolution was won with only 3% of the population taking arms against the British Empire. Is there any factual basis for such claims? Well, Steve, I've heard this claim too. It really doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not sure how anyone reached the conclusion that only 3% of the population took up arms against the British during the Revolutionary War. To me, it seems to not have any basis in fact. But let's take a closer look at the numbers. In total, best estimates tell us that 231,000 men served in the Continental Army over the course of the war. That's more than 9% of the estimated 2.5 million people who were living in the colonies at the time. And if you leave women and children and slaves out of that overall population, the percentage of those who served as Continentals were probably more like 25% of the potentially eligible population. Aside from Continental Army service, a great many more served in various colonial and state militias, as well as naval service and state-run armies, making that percentage much higher. This number, of course, does not take into account the number of people who supported the war effort in a civilian capacity as well. The supplemental forces of state soldiers and the militia were critical in several important battles. I don't see how any legitimate analysis would restrict those under arms to just the Continental soldiers. So, trying to figure out where this number came from, I looked at whether you could consider those who were under arms at any one time as being closer to that 3% number. At its height, the Continental Army had as many as 48,000 men under arms. That, of course, would be far lower than the 3% of the total population. Perhaps the number was calculated based on soldiers that actually participated in battle, but given that it would be extremely difficult to figure out how many men fought in more than one battle, I don't see how you could get the numbers to make an estimation on that basis. Given the numbers, I don't see how anyone came to the conclusion that the war was fought by only 3% of the population, unless they were just looking at very different numbers than are my understanding of what the numbers were, or they just made it up. But since I'm not really sure how the calculation might have been attempted, I really can't say for certain. The reality is, though, that the revolution could not have been won without the overwhelming support of the population, and with large numbers of that population serving under arms to win the war. If such a small number of even highly committed soldiers could overthrow and replace the government, I don't think we'd consider that a revolution. I think we'd call that a military coup d'etat. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.